I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute for Ethics and Public Life, the Center for Teaching Excellence, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to today's program. Today we have Portia Turco, who is the coordinator of our clinical mental health counseling program, and also runs our Ward Hall Counseling Clinic. So I'd like to turn it over to Portia. Portia is going to get us started in thinking about some of the dynamics that we need to in terms of what happens when there's trauma in our classes and workspaces, and what are those ethical implications of dealing with it or not dealing with it. Welcome. Thank you, Portia.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I think that this is probably the most appropriate time for us to be thinking about trauma in the classroom, especially as we look at that past year and a half, right? So what are some of the things that have happened in the last year and a half? What are some things that we could just identify off the bat? Pandemic. What else?
School shootings.
School shootings, we've had those, right, consistently over the last decade. What else has happened?
The election.
Elections, so we've had some tensions around the elections. But what else? What are some things that we notice are maybe behaviors, feelings, thoughts, reactions that come out of situations like that?
There's some emboldening of people acting like jerks.
Yeah, so we notice that maybe our moderating our feelings and our reactions is not quite as how we would expect it to be. What else would you say? What have you noticed over the last year?
I think everybody's just in a heightened state of emotion in general, with COVID, with a lot of those police violence related incidents and other political incidents. And, I think everything just coming at the same time while also being all cooped up.
Yes, and I think that that's a great word. When you say heightened, we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about trauma, especially trauma in the classroom and trauma in higher education. So what I'm going to do today, everybody, how we're going to spend our time is I'm going to give a brief overview of what trauma looks like in the brain. I think this is relevant for us as we look at education and we look at learning. So I'm going to give us a very brief overview. We definitely could spend a lot of time talking about what the brain is doing and how that impacts things, but I want to look at learning, and hopefully we can spend some time also thinking about what happens in terms of creating safety in the classroom. So when we look at trauma, what is traumatic stress? I want to differentiate between PTSD. So PTSD is a clinical diagnosis of somebody who's gone through a traumatic event and they start to experience some of the symptomology, right? So I'm going to say that we're not looking at PTSD today. We're not discussing PTSD. We're looking at trauma in general. So trauma is associated with the feelings of being overwhelmed, right? You talked about heightened. So there's a general sense of being overwhelmed. There's a general sense of threat. So when we think about trauma, we're thinking about threat. And then we're thinking about an individual's ability to manage the threat, right? So what you're gonna find with that is that there's increased vulnerability. So as we think of the last year, let's take this last year, what are some threats that have happened that would decrease people's ability to cope and maybe increase that vulnerability? What are some things that you can think about?
Disruptions to childcare and school.
So disruptions in all facets, right? Thinking about work, thinking about some of us who are feeling disrupted in our ability to get food, so some food insecurity. So some of us childcare, some of us transportation, some of us learning. So learning was impacted, being able to access learning. I'm thinking about for us up here, especially in the Adirondack region, internet was a challenge for a lot of people, being able to access education. So when we look at threat, we look at a hierarchy, right? We're looking at our basic needs. So basic needs are survival needs. So a lot of us found that our survival needs were threatened. So this is what happens, everybody. When our basic survival needs are threatened, you're going to find that that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness happens, right? So that general sense of being chaotic, of the world being unpredictable.
So we do have a comment from online that the pandemic is a chronic threat, not an acute one, which makes it harder to deal with because of the duration.
And I think that that's an important point, because when the pandemic started, it was acute, very heightened, right? So a lot of us were experiencing that level of fear. Now, when a threat is chronic, when a trauma is chronic, what happens is a lot of the time, we don't react out of that elevated state of fear, that we're not getting panic attacks maybe, but what happens is we get numb. So what we get is a state of what we call freeze, that chronic state of being maybe emotionally unresponsive. It looks like apathy, it looks like we're not interested, it looks like we're disengaged. It might also look like we're sarcastic, that we're like caustic, that we're not showing interest. So it's very important. I'll talk about that in a minute, and that was a great comment on Facebook. But what happens when we have chronic trauma and we have elevated levels of stress or decrease in stress is that you're gonna find that it interferes with our relationships, right? So a lot of us probably saw on social media when we were reading that we saw states of domestic violence go up, conflict goes up, but people's beliefs about the world around them also changes, right? What would be an example of that? Change in beliefs. Yeah.
The Black Lives Matter movement, I think.
Yeah, so we see a lot of movement maybe coming together in ways to change systems, right? To change systems. What else would we see? So beliefs might be perhaps a change in feeling safe, feeling that the world is not predictable, that the world is not safe, that I cannot trust other people, I cannot trust things that I thought I could trust before. So that's one of the impacts of trauma. And then that feeling of I'm not going to be able to cope with this, I'm not going to be able to make it, right? So some of the sources of stress that we might see, some of them we've mentioned, could be loss or death. You know, a lot of people lost loved ones, family members, co-workers, and so that increases that risk level. Accidents, so a lot of accidents, homelessness. We saw this a lot with people who couldn't pay rent, right? So some of that was maybe moderated a little bit by that extension in evictions, but as soon as we lost that ability, people are facing eviction. Violence, we saw increased levels of violence. Abuse, like I said, domestic violence went up. Some people were really concerned about children and abuse at home, right? So if you think that safety at school, this is lost. And then natural disasters too. What are some natural disasters that we were faced with last year?
Texas had their winter storm, I remember.
Yeah, do you remember that winter storm? I don't know if people remember the ice storm that happened. That was completely unexpected in Texas. Yes.
California with the fire.
The fires. So all of these things are cumulative, right? So when we look at trauma, we need to understand that trauma and vulnerability is a cumulative process. Most of the time in psychotherapy, what we call that, we call them type 1 and type 2 traumas. So type 1 or 2. Type 1 traumas are what we call single event traumas. So this is one thing that happened to you. And then typically this type of trauma is easy to recover from. You can recover really quickly because your resources are not completely overwhelmed. A type 2 trauma is more complex because what happens is you have one thing after the next thing after the next thing after the next thing that's threatening your survival. And I would argue that a lot of us last year over the course of the pandemic, we've gone through type 2 traumas, right? So some people have lost jobs, some people have lost houses, some people have lost loved ones, some people have gotten sick themselves, so they've lost their health. So it's one thing after the next, right? So we saw some acts of terrorism, we saw, of course, the pandemic is our overall right now. So what's particularly important for us in higher education as we look at trauma and we look at the impact of traumatic stress is all of the brain regions. The brain is complex. We have a lot of different parts to the brain, but the parts that I'm going to talk about today briefly are these three areas. This is what we call the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This is our this is probably the youngest part of our brain. This is our thinking brain. This is the brain that makes us distinctly human. Because all of what we call executive functions live in the prefrontal cortex. So the front of the brain is responsible for the parts of us that learn. A lot of learning. The back of the brain, if you look at it, the back of the brain is what we call the limbic brain. The limbic brain is responsible for a lot of automatic processes, your heart rate, your heartbeat, all of the things you cannot really control yourself. Your brain does them automatically. Then there's another region, this area of the brain called the amygdala right here. This is, in a nutshell, this is where trauma gets activated, stress gets activated. This is where the alarm goes off in your brain. So when we look at traumatic stress, we look at the impact on those three regions. So for us, here on campus, when we think about trauma, we want to focus on the prefrontal cortex and what it does during a traumatic experience. So, like I said, everybody, this is our thinking cap. When everything is well, and I've had breakfast, I've had night good sleep, when I've rested, and I'm like feeling relaxed and ready to come to class and learn, that part of the brain is alert, it's awake, it's working, right? So this is the part that allows me to have empathy. Say somebody's sharing a story, I can listen to them and attend to them. I can listen to them with being connected to them. I can have insight, so somebody's teaching me something. I gain insight, I can think about it and I can process it. And I can also regulate my response. Say I disagree with this, I can stop and think, how do I want to say that? How do I want to react to this? I can manage my body. Let's say this has been a long lecture. I can say, okay, I need to stay awake. I've got my lectures are 3 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes. We've got long lectures in counselor education. So let's say somebody's alert, the prefrontal cortex is working, they'll be able to say, okay, let me take deep breaths, the lecture will be over soon, then I can go and eat lunch. So the prefrontal cortex is really regulating your impulse, right? Your morality, being able to choose right from wrong, comes from the thinking part of the brain. Remember, the limbic brain has no moral reason, cannot think, it cannot reason about anything. It requires the front of the brain to look at an action and make decisions about it, right? My intuition, although it's connected to other parts of me, like memory, it largely lives in the front of the brain, right? Being able to attune to other people in class, to participate in a discussion, to work with other people, and then also to moderate fear. So when I'm threatened, this is a big part of trauma. So what happens is the front of the brain is keeping me alert, right? It's keeping me aware, keeping me attuned, keeping me interested, and keeping me polite if I disagree with you, okay? Now everybody, what happens when the prefrontal cortex is shut down? What do you think happens? What might you see in somebody whose prefrontal cortex is not alert and not awake? Just a guess.
They might not think before they do, so like they just might be impulsive.
Very impulsive, they're quick to react. What else might you see?
Little attention to detail, and perhaps their trigger for anger is a lot shorter.
Very quick-tempered, very irritable, quick-tempered, easily triggered. What else would you see?
Well, that's what I was going to say, grumpy. I mean, that's my classic thing.
Yeah, you might see somebody who's grumpy a lot, really grumpy. How many people know somebody who's, when they're hungry, they get really grumpy and angry?
That's me.
Right?
Oh my God.
That's like a like an angry person, they call it. So that part of your brain is linked to survival, right? The part of you that says, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I have no place to sleep, is controlled by the limbic brain, back of your brain. So the reason why the prefrontal cortex is important when it comes to trauma is that it's going to regulate all of the triggering, right? So triggers are things that set you off, right? You might hear something or see something that reminds you of a trauma, and then the brain, this is why the brain is fascinating. Your brain does not need something to be factual for it to be true, for it to be triggered. Okay, so when an alarm goes off in the brain, okay, how many people have been through, like, we have like drills here on campus. Sometimes it will go off. How do we know it's a drill? How do we know it's not the real thing?
The way other surroundings react.
We watch our surroundings. Sometimes we'll look and be like, oh, nobody's running, nobody's, okay. So the challenge with the brain's alarm system is that it doesn't differentiate between actual threat or imagined threat. It doesn't differentiate. So when your brain sees something that looks similar to something that's happened before, or that you smell something that seems like it's happened before, your brain is going to trigger a reaction for you to cope with that, right? And I think this is important, especially when it comes to trauma-informed classrooms, is that sometimes we believe something has to actually happen for somebody to be triggered, but that's not true. Just the thought of something can trigger you, right? It can be imagined. So, but the brain doesn't differentiate. It doesn't say, oh, this is a fire drill. It says, there's a danger, be alert, be alert. So it wakes you up. Go ahead.
That's, what it strikes me as being very, very helpful when teaching, because another part of that is you don't know a student's, or you don't know all their past educational experiences. So something that to you seems like, say, perfectly reasonable feedback about an assignment might be this kind of trigger of trauma, even though it's not a threat, but if the student has had a traumatically stressful experience, it could cause that reaction.
Absolutely, absolutely true. And the reason being, so remember what I said about type 1 and type 2 traumas? Type 1 single incident traumas are pretty common, but type 2 are even significantly more common, right? We have a study that's called the ACEs study. So the ACEs study, tells us that most of us in this room, if you think about us, between 1 in 3 or 1 in 5, have had more than 2 or 3 traumas in our lifetimes. So if you think about just us in this room, most of us, according to the research, can identify instances of trauma that go beyond just one type. So what that means is that perhaps I'm grading an assignment, or I'm giving feedback, or I'm having a discussion with you and I disagree, but I'm doing it in a way that sets off a trigger. Your brain doesn't say, I'm in the classroom anymore. It says that threat is happening again, right? And people get activated like that.
So we have a comment from Ruben on Facebook that kind of relates to what Dustin was saying, in that it applies the pandemic to it. I think that we have a situation with the pandemic, political issues, climate issues, social media issues, that have created a perfect storm when it comes to trauma. Mental illness and stress throughout our communities, our country, and the world. And as a result, we are in unprecedented, uncharted waters, so to speak.
And that would be what we call complex trauma, right? So type 2 is a very complex. So what you discussed on there talks to the complexity of all of it. Now remember what I said, when we get to this type of trauma, we're not going to always see somebody's elevation. They're not always elevated and angry and fearful. They might be completely disengaged, shut down, disinterested, not participating, or maybe not even showing up to class. right? So what may look like a lack of interest is actually complex trauma where the brain shuts down completely, right? So how I like to describe this process, I put that visual there because I think it really captures what I want us to think about when we think about trauma. So this is what I teach to my students in counseling class, is that I want you to understand when a trigger happens, when people are triggered, the brain goes into a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? So I want you to imagine right now that the tiger comes into this room. There's a tiger coming. There's a tiger coming into this room, what are you going to do? Imagine, try to imagine a tiger coming. There's a tiger coming. It's in this room, what do? What are you going to do? There's a tiger coming.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop. The
Mhm.
first thing, not necessarily freezing, but I don't want to move aggressively, so it attacks me. So stopping is the first one, and looking at like my optics, like, can I head for the door? I know jumping on the podium isn't worth it.
Right.
But I would strategically stop.
You stop. Yes.
Before I acted.
Anybody else, what do? There's a tiger coming. You have, the tiger's here, what do?
I think my impulsiveness would just make me want to run outside,
run.
even though like in the back of my head I'm like, oh, you're supposed to stay still. Like, yeah, but I would just run out.
Out of here, right?
Yeah.
Other people, what do? There's a tiger. You don't have time to negotiate with the tiger. What do? Tiger coming. What do? Tiger's here.
I'd probably freeze first
Freeze.
and hope that I could sneak out, but yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't want to make a sudden move.
And I think so if people remember nothing from me from today, I want you to remember that one thing. That trauma in the brain, how your brain reacts to a traumatic trigger, is the same as if there was a tiger coming in the room. Okay? So when there's a tiger charging at you, your brain says, I really don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. So there's a tiger coming. Are you thinking about lunch? No. Are you thinking about sleep? No. Do you want to do homework? Okay. Are you going to do a group discussion? Are you going to post anything on Moodle? There's a tiger coming. What's your brain going to do? Your brain is, you have to survive. Right? So trauma is like a tiger to your brain. And in fact, this is the research. The research says because our brains were created, our brains are pretty old, right? Of course, we have neuroplasticity. Our brain keeps learning and changing, but what we have not changed yet in the human brain is our stress response. So our brains were created from when we lived in the cave, right? And in the cave, we needed to survive wild animals. So when my brain senses threat, it reacts as if there's a tiger coming. It doesn't think this is a midterm. It's not saying, oh, this midterm, relax. It's saying midterm is going to eat me. Okay, so what do? So I want us to think about that because the brain is going to prepare you for action. Either you're going to freeze, right? The freeze response is not understood really well because it looks like apathy, sometimes it looks like depression, sometimes it looks like somebody who's disengaged. But it's one of our first initial reactions. Believe it or not, most of us don't think run. We think hide, freeze, pretend to be dead. Right? So that's how, think about deer in the headlights. That's our first response, is just to stop and not move, right?
Ruben on Facebook said fight or flight will kick in and your adrenaline levels will surge.
Your adrenaline goes up, your cortisol goes up, your norepinephrine goes up. All of these chemicals do lots of different things, but the main thing is that they shut down your digestion, which is why you'll see with chronic stress, you'll see people dysregulated in their appetite. Either they want to eat too much or eat too little, they feel queasy, little kids will say, my stomach feels like there's butterflies in it, right? That's that cortisol being released. You will hear people say, and in fact, little children, you will hear them say, I need to go to the bathroom. They're not imagining that, actually. That's your body emptying everything so that you can be prepared for action, okay? Your body says, you don't have time to eat. You gotta get rid of everything. I need the energy. That glucose needs to be processed so that my muscles can work. so that my heart beats faster, so that I have that strength and resources. In fact, what happens, you get tunnel vision, right? Which is why when you start to try and discuss things, you can think. The tunnel vision is geared for the tiger only, looking at what the problem is.
Sarah on Facebook said, I think sometimes people may not even notice that they're in flight / fight / freeze mode because it becomes so normal. That is when trauma can be dangerous for the body.
Absolutely. But remember, if a tiger's here, everybody, and most of us are saying, we might run, we might freeze, your body uses that energy, uses all of those neurochemicals. Your neurotransmitters are firing in the brain, getting you ready to do something, right? The problem with trauma, both of these, or stress even, not even trauma, just stress, being stressed all the time, is that your body doesn't use up that energy. So it's trapped in the body, but your body's shut down. So what happens is you're destroying your body. That's why chronic stress is bad for you. So if your body says, here's adrenaline, run, and you don't run. Fight, and you don't fight, and then your brain says, maybe I didn't give you enough. I'll give you more, because you didn't get the first signal. The more elevated you get, the more sick you get. It damages your internal organs. Your heart can't keep pumping like that. Your body can't keep doing that. So chronic stress is really actually very dangerous for us, right? And we don't talk enough about that. So when this body's doing that, so fight, we know. Most of us are not taking down the tiger, but some people fight. That's what road rage is, right? It's that fight response. Some people flee, they run away. The freeze response I talked about, in the classroom it might look like somebody who's not paying attention. Somebody who's daydreaming, looking outside the window, right? The fawn response is another response we don't talk about a lot, but in psychology, the fawn response is what we call people-pleasing, right? So people-pleasing, perfectionism, the desire to please can lead to people taking on more and more and more and more and more as a way to appease threat, right? So people-pleasing can be a trauma reaction. And we don't talk about that either. Those two, the freeze and the fawn response.
When you're in here, or people trying to cope with these reactions, does the phone fit in? Because it seems like the phone, it's everybody's security blanket. It's specifically designed to get our attention. Can it show up as as one of these, disengaging, like people turning to look at the phone, look at the phone, look at the phone, as a response?
So think about, what does looking at the phone do for us? So when we preoccupied with the phone, think about what does that do for us?
I think, like, in my perspective, I think it's just like going shopping. You're trying to, like, please yourself or soothe yourself using these tools.
Spot on. That's self-regulation, right? But remember, that's what I said earlier, that in the prefrontal cortex, when I'm stressed or under trauma, I can regulate my body. So I need something else. It can be my phone, and on campus it can be drinking too much. It can be compulsive shopping, it can be overeating, it can be many things. So what it does though, think about what I said. There's a tiger coming. I can't run, I can't fight, I'm frozen. But maybe I just want to avoid. See, avoidance is also misunderstood. Avoidance is super, super helpful in the brain in the short term, right? So when I avoid doing things, people say procrastination. I procrastinate a lot. Procrastination is misunderstood. It's a stress reaction. Procrastination feels good in the short term, but then in the long term, it doubles up the anxiety and the stress and the worry. But in the short term, it feels great, right? Go ahead.
Not to disagree.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Please disagree, then we can discuss
No,
it.
I just don't like the pictures. I know they're live streaming too, my children and that, but sometimes I procrastinate because it takes me a long time to do my project.
Yes.
And instead of starting it now, it's better for me to start it later and just like stress at that time instead of stressing out about my assignments the whole week. And then just like beginning it and then stressing out by myself. Sometimes it is true that like it is accumulating.
Yeah.
But sometimes we avoid it, me and my friends avoid it we don't want that to stress us right now because we have another thing that we have to focus on. So it's more of like, does that make sense?
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. Okay, go ahead, before I answer you, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I agree. If this is on, certified, I call it strategic anxiety. Like, I will let this amp up for a little bit, and then I know I'm gonna get anxious about it, and I'll turn it on, and go full on, and get it done faster than I would have if I did it sooner.
Okay, so now think about what I told you about what the brain will do under stress. Why do you think that happens? So why? Because both of you, what you're saying is true. So what you're saying is avoidance is good in the short term, but not good in the long term. Everybody's saying, but sometimes I'm more productive the more I avoid, and the deadline is right here. So think about why that is though. Based on what I just told you, why would that be true?
I think like something I've learned about myself recently is that being stressed out is actually good for me in a way, because like the other semesters when I had so much free time, I wouldn't get, like, I would be doing so bad and like I would not take care of myself. But when I'm stressed and have like my days planned out and like so much things to do in the day, then I feel more accomplished and more like, you know, like proud of myself.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Do you know why, everybody? Can you guess? You know what? Remember what I said, when your brain says there's a tiger in the room right now. So if that paper is due at 11:59 tonight, what is the brain saying to me? There's a tiger in the room. So what will happen is my brain will completely shut everything else out except that paper or project. And I get what's called tunnel vision, and I'm actually able to focus better. And I can get it done like that, because all of my resources are focused on that one thing. And then I feel like I've been productive, I did it, I got it done. But what's the side effect of that? I've produced huge amounts of adrenaline, huge amounts of cortisol, which is a stress chemical. So what I've done is I'm destroying my body. But it's true, it does help. It does, it gets you focused, you get it done. A lot of students tell me that I can just whip up a paper like this if it's due in like 6 hours. But the damage to yourself and your well-being is the price you pay for that, right?
And also, authentic learning can't happen in one short burst. Authentic learning happens over time, where you practice and you get feedback and you revise and you reflect. It takes a long time. So you could be achieving a short-term, like check a box on an assignment, but how much are you going to remember about what you just did? How can you go back and use those skills again? Are you going to be able to even, like, go back, I read that paper, what the hell did I write? I don't remember. I was just trying to get it done.
Go ahead.
Isn't this the system issue though? Because we're expected to always submit assignments, we're always expected to have the perfect assignment, and then we're always expected to have something in our way. I felt you were talking about me when you said people pleaser, because I'm always like trying to be a TA, trying to be a research assistant, trying to have my research conducted. I have so many things, but that's because grad school is one that accepts me if I don't do those things.
Yes.
So like the system expects me to have this adrenaline time, to have this tunnel vision, otherwise I'm not going to succeed. So in some ways or another, it's not something we volunteer to get into, it's the system that's making us do it. Like sometimes there are students that are like very good, who get things done a week in advance and stuff, but for us, if we don't do that, then we're gonna die. So like the tiger is not always thinking just procrastination, just for one assignment. It's thinking the bigger image of, can I get a job? Can I get into grad school? And if I don't have these things, then I'm gonna fail. And I think, I don't know, just.
And I think you were spot on. This is part of what we're going to be talking about, the ethics of all of this, right? This is going to be another topic, because you are not far off. You are not far off on the demands of what we look for when we think about what you need to attain versus learning, right? We have another topic coming up on the ethics. We're going to talk about grading. We're going to talk about all of what you discussed, is how are we measuring that you're learning, really? right? And part, I'm gonna come back to this point of what you mentioned because I think it's important. So the brain needs that time. I'm gonna show you a couple of things and then I'll leave the brain for a minute. But like I said, we can spend all day on this. See, when you learn, you're doing a lot of things in the brain. Remember that part that I said is called the hippocampus, that middle brain? The amygdala, when it's alert and it's activated and you're scared, your brain doesn't lay down your memories properly. Okay? So if I'm scared or I'm triggered in class, my brain doesn't put that information in the right filing cabinet, if you want to call it. It misplaces it. Because it's saying, I don't really want to know that. I want to keep you alive, right? So what happens is the encoding, it's what we call encoding, and then the retrieve. The retrieval process is damaged. And that's why you find people who are traumatized, they can't quite remember the whole story. It's fragmented, it's in pieces, it's like confusing, it's jumbled up. It's because the brain didn't have time to lay down the sequence, right? So what you were talking to is that idea that when I learn like this under pressure, under adrenaline, I'll get the paper done because my brain says I need to survive, but my encoding is gonna be problematic. And my retrieving of it, like what was it that I learned? How does it apply? It becomes a problem, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Ruben said on Facebook, some people need to have a sense of pressure in order to be motivated. And I just wanted to say, like, I agree with what you said about the assignments, like just having the checkbox done, because I've like, with some classes, I've like, okay, as long as it's submitted, and like I've written essays that I don't even go back and read, like especially discussion posts, because I'm like, I know it makes no sense, but I'm just trying to get the grade at the end of the day. And like, especially when it comes towards math, I've literally remembered nothing about math. Like even for high school, like when I came here, I was like, oh, all these equations we learned in high school, and I was like, I don't. As soon as I'm done with that class, I think my brain is just like, okay, you're done. You don't have to remember anything anymore. And it's kind of like bad because, you know, you do need it, but
so
yeah.
Your retrieval is a problem, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I agree with a lot of this. What I'm curious about though, is how do you tell the difference between this and just some of the natural processes? Like I know, once again, everybody has their own experience. I sometimes feel like I have multiple brains out there, because every once in a while something will pop and go, okay, now you can pay attention to me, I figured this thing out for you, and you go with that. And sometimes I need that procrastination, I need that delay for those systems to kick in for them to start going ahead and doing that. And it's not even like I'm focusing in on it at that point, I'm focusing on something totally different. And all of a sudden, we've all done this, where you all of a sudden remember the name of the person you saw down the hallway, and you're like, geez, I wish I knew who they were, and then it came in. I don't know how that fits into this, and how to differentiate, I guess, would be the question. Because obviously we want to be able to help people who are having that, but at the same time, if this is a part of the natural, how do you separate that? Is there a way to separate that?
So I guess how I'm thinking about what you're asking me is there's a difference between stress and trauma.
Yes.
So under stress, we may find it difficult to remember the name. What year was that? But under trauma, my brain shut down completely.
Okay.
Right? So both of those work very similarly, but the other one has that feeling of changing the way you look at the world, the way you feel safe. The other one is I've exhausted my ability, I have no bandwidth anymore. So the only way I can rest and recover is to really temporarily disengage all of these things. So you want to think about it in terms of those two, even though biochemically they're not too different. They're like very similar in the amount of chemicals or the chemicals you produce.
Okay.
But in terms of trauma, it has the ability to change that person's view of themselves, the world, how they function in it, and their place in it. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So what we're looking at here for learning, everybody, are these things we need to encode. Right? We need to encode. We need to be able to retrieve information, and we need to be able to apply it. When there's a tiger in the room coming for me, this doesn't happen, or if it happens, it's scrambled. Right? I can't remember things that go together, they mixed up, they misfiled, basically. Right? It's how many people have a junk drawer in there? That's kind of like what happens. Your brain creates, it's not gone, but it's like jumbled up and you can't find it anymore. Easily anyway, or sometimes you're stepping on something and you're like, oh, it's a pen. And it keeps happening like that, right? So part of it is being able to manage these two systems.
So this is making a lot of sense to me in that this semester I'm seeing a lot of students have trouble with reading comprehension. They're, you know, and I can tell they've even read the book, they've got sticky notes in it, and they've marked it up. But they're not retaining anything.
Right.
And so again, we see the effects of stress that maybe, I've been wondering if these students, you know, normally would have been able to comprehend and retain this information, but now they are having trouble with both retaining and comprehending.
And comprehension is an executive function issue that stands in the front of the brain. So that makes sense again to what we're discussing. Remember that your brain doesn't want, it's not going to keep any of this information if your life is at risk, right? It has to prioritize what's important, right? So that's what gets affected. It's not that you can't read, it's that you can't understand what you're reading. Okay, you can't understand what you're reading. So some of those physiological effects, hypervigilance, we talked about that, heightened, difficulty concentrating, can't concentrate, vision and hearing gets impaired, right? Hyperactivity can look like you're hyperactive. In fact, in little kids who are traumatized, it looks a lot like ADHD. And ADHD does exist, but sometimes it gets misconfused. When kids are traumatized, children have the trauma, they look like that. Avoidance, we talked about. Sleep patterns get disrupted, difficulty sleeping, or difficulty sustaining sleep. You fall asleep really hard, but you wake up a few times. Sleeping, eating, self-injury, which can come from self-regulation, trying to regulate yourself, and maybe self-medication. Substances can increase a lot with trauma. Emotional effects could be the difficulty to process emotions through language, right? Sometimes you see people struggle to explain how they feel, or they can't connect to how they feel numb. And then hypersensitivity to trauma in other people, really being reactive, diminished range of emotions. So this person maybe is just angry all the time, a lot of anger, or irritable. Depression or sadness, which is that freeze response, or feeling worthless, a lot of shame, or feeling of sense of inadequacy, that I'm not going to be able to do this, I can't do this, I can't do things. Some bad memories, or outbreaks, like different outbreaks of different emotions and dissociation. Cognitive effects is what we talked about a lot with encoding and retrieving. So laying down of those memories in the hippocampus so you can find them when you need them. Right? Can't remember details. Your memory is impaired. Like it's spotty. It's different spotty. Can't attend. Can't concentrate. Lack of goal setting. You feel like you're kind of like moving around, but you really have no sense of purpose. Can't problem solve. This last one is really, really important to talk about. That sense of shortened future. That sense of shortened future we see resonate a lot in complex trauma. This is where people feel like they're not going to live long, right?
Is that when trigger warning, when like suicide comes into play, like that?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, or sometimes it's that sense of there's no point. There's no point in making plans for the future because I might not be here, right? I might not be here. I might not be around. Or what's the point? That sense that things are futile, right? There's no need.
It almost seems like the sense of short future is connected to almost a lack of hope.
Yes.
Once things become that traumatic, that there just isn't that. There is no.
Yeah.
You know, it's just.
It definitely is that hopelessness, right? But think about people who are hopeless can also seem impulsive, right? So the risky behavior goes up, right? So if I'm like, I'm gonna die anyway, what's the point? So you might see somebody who's doing a lot of risky things, and you're like, what's going on with this person? The risky behavior is an indication that they've lost that sense. So you want to keep an eye on that too. That's a very, very telling sign. People, when they start to do high-risk behaviors, I'm starting to look for trauma, right? Some kind of trauma. So, all right, everybody. Now we're going to look at some objectives, some quick objectives for us. Any questions so far from Facebook? I'm moving out of the brain work.
Kevin McCullen had an interesting note about a book called Structured Procrastination. It might be worthwhile for people to look at if they have a chance online.
It's called structured procrastination.
Right. He talks about there's heavy stress when you don't know intuitively how long a task will take.
Oh, great. Thank you for that resource. Thanks for that resource. So, everybody, I'm going to give us some really quick overviews on some of the principles of trauma-informed teaching or trauma-informed classroom spaces. So when we look at trauma-informed work, the main thing we want to know is what we just discussed, that trauma has an impact on the brain, it has an impact on learning, and to know the different signs that you might see in somebody who's traumatized or who's going under a stressor, a pretty significant stressor. Know that within yourself, know that people around you. And then also the goal is to minimize that re-traumatization, right? In mental health, we have a term, we call it vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma happens when we hear stories of trauma. So a lot of us clinicians who do therapy, we hear a lot of trauma stories. So part of that process is being able to calm yourself down so your body is not going into fight, flight, freeze, right, or fawn. And remember what I said earlier is that your brain doesn't need it to be true for you to be into that state, right? Yeah.
What about people who trauma dump, like especially online? When I'm seeing like on TikTok where people post a video and under the comments like a bunch of people are just talking like trauma dumping.
Yes.
Especially if someone's talking about something good that's going on in their life and in the comments people are just saying like trauma dumping over and over again.
That's
like
a
how do
great
you
point, actually.
Yeah.
And when you read that repeatedly and you're exposed to that, you can traumatize yourself, right? So that's why sometimes I will encourage people, especially when we're looking at the media, right? Media can have some positive aspects in that it can promote a lot of social justice work. Sometimes though you have to really be a critical consumer to know, I know what we need to be doing, I know how to advocate, but do I need to watch these visuals that keep kind of being repeated over and over again? Do I need to watch the extent of that all the time? Can I still be a social justice advocate without having to see all these things, right? So it's about critical consumption and maybe giving yourself permission sometimes to turn the TV off. Often I think we feel compelled to watch because we think we need to be involved, we need to do something, and that's true, but I don't always need to watch the same clip all day to be able to do something about it, right? So just being able to be aware when you've had enough to give yourself permission to not read that, and then identifying successful educational outcomes goes back to what you were saying. Like how are we accountable as your educators to make sure that you're actually learning? We don't put pressure that doesn't really seem basis. Like when we construct our lessons, we want some outcomes, particular outcomes, and that they match all of the work that we need you to do. Right? That's what that talks to.
And I would even add, building on that point, that there's new research strongly indicating that there's aspects of traditional K-12 schooling, take out pandemic, take out political upheaval, take out all those other things. There's aspects of traditional education that can be traumatizing.
Yeah.
That grading systems, that school systems can create some of that traumatic stress. So these are things I would say, no matter what was happening in these big events, for the educators need to be aware of this. College educators need to be aware of these and employing these always.
Yeah. And I mean, I can talk a little bit about culturally responsive pedagogy, right? I'll touch on that because that's not our topic today, just for like a minute. So part of what we know through that research is that a lot of our students of color, their voices are marginalized in higher education. right? And that's because the structure of higher education favors certain ways of being and of being represented. So a quick example is in how we write. So for our students in grad school use APA formatting, so APA 7. APA 7 is a little bit less stringent than APA 6 on the use of first person when you write. But a lot of cultures have a preference for first person. And if you think about different ways of the dialects, different English dialects, which ones do we correct? And which ones are the correct version of English versus, so when you think about that, when you think about whose voice is marginalized, even in writing papers. So if I wrote my paper in the way that my English natively is being taught, that would be incorrect, right? It's a correct version of English. So school, when you think about grading, think about how we favor, how we look at assignments, how we structure assignments can be a form of oppression in certain ways, right? And that's a topic for, we have another topic on this, it's coming up. We'll be back to that. So successful educational outcomes really take into consideration all of that. And then we're looking at empowerment. How are we empowering you to take what we've taught you and be able to get into grad school if that's where you're going, or for my students to be able to practice that in the field. So am I teaching you something that you can get in and actually work and do what you need to do in a competent manner, right? And then maximizing choice and a sense of control. So we talked about recognizing trauma. I'm going to go back to these. So safety, just a quick word to safety, is looking at our material. So really thinking about how do we inform students, how do we inform you when you're looking at it that this has the potential to be activating, can activate you, but also I think the responsibility to be selective, to like what is the real point of using this material? Can I choose something different? Right? Can I choose something different? Doing check-ins. So part of checking in is being able to assess how students are doing with the material. This can be a verbal or it can be written check-ins. I enjoy written check-ins, sometimes because they don't put that pressure on somebody having to respond, but check-ins can be anonymous. So leave a little card with a note. And this is before cross-opinion surveys, right? This is pretty early in the semester to gauge how everybody's doing. Using feedback to revise. So sometimes even doing check-ins at midterm. So what else do we need to do? How else could we do it differently? Can be really helpful in revising the last part of the semester. Allowing processing of difficult content. So if there have been readings or videos or assignments, having a little bit of time to check in and process the impact of that and how people are taking that in, and finding out what was the most challenging or difficult about this content. Reminding people that they can leave. Like I said, for us, a lot of our students deal with trauma. That's part of their training. So being able to know you can leave and take care of yourself is really valuable. And that's fine if you don't want to participate today. So we talked about reviewing and disclosure. So for us, once again, our courses tend to have a high chance for self-disclosure. That's part of training. So being able to really be specific that you have a choice not to self-disclose. It's optional. And what are the guidelines when somebody's self-disclosed? I find sometimes the challenge is the self-disclosure and then the room is silent. That can be really traumatizing too, that I've just shared this big thing. So how do you support somebody who's really disclosed something that is really meaningful to them? And then another piece that we're looking at when we look at lights and sounds, remember that trauma can even be a smell. Smell, a light, sound. So thinking about like being really inclusive of asking, how do we sit? How can we, right now we have some limitations, right? Because we're trying to distance and trying to maintain that, but once we are past this stage, even just thinking about how we set up the classroom to be supportive and trauma sensitive. And movement, how do we move, how do we, personal space, how we use that. And then choice and empowerment, I like that idea of students being co-creators. Like, what do you think of this assignment? I'm trying to get you to learn this, and as your instructor, I need to measure that you know how to do that. But what are some flexibility areas around this assignment? Right? How would this fit what you need to know? Really being empowering in that way, looking at different topics, different formatting, and being flexible around that. And then also another thing that I hear a lot from students, especially students of color, is the idea of being inclusive in terms of naming people. Like really trying hard to learn people's names and pronouncing them correctly. Or also just being sensitive to preferred pronouns. And another part is the tokenism, right? Being really careful that we're not, especially when we're in situations where we don't have a lot of racial diversity in the room, or gender diversity, and so on, that we don't pick on the few students who really then can be activated by that process. And that's that for me. I try to keep the time. So any other questions that I'm missing as we look at just maybe this model of how do we engage trauma-informed classrooms?
I think so. Like it's like managing it. So even in like little conversations that we're having in like PR class, I remember we were talking about how to, like things to do with BLM, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think people look, how do we manage not looking towards certain students for the answer?
Yes.
Or like knowing that, you know, we're not addressing that. We're not trying to solve world peace.
Yeah.
Like, we're just trying to discuss things. Like, how do we manage going about setting boundaries? I think that's something that's really important that you have in the classroom.
Yeah.
And even the checking in thing that you offer, like, that's really good. But then it could also turn into trauma dumping on your professor.
Yes. So what you are saying is be able to moderate the discussion. Because one of the things that I do hear is that sometimes I'm a therapist, so it's a little bit different for me teaching, because I am a therapist, but it's not intended to be therapy, right? And I'm not doing therapy with students, but I need to know how to have a discussion that's effective, and also when to use resources. So we have resources that we offer, the counseling center, we have the community, like where do you go when it feels like it's more than, it's impacting somebody. So being able to know that, but also being able to know how, maybe like demonstrating how do we have a discussion where we disagree with each other, but we can be friends when we leave, right? It's okay to disagree. When does it cross a line though? Right? So being able to have those discussions. Yeah, any other thoughts? Everybody?
So, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, is there one on?
Yeah, there's
Okay,
a
go
timer.
ahead and share what's
No,
on.
there's a timer. It's
Oh,
gonna
a
shut it
timer.
off. Sorry.
Okay. All right, so I know that we are closing in on 1 o'clock, and some people have to get to class or to meetings. So I do want to invite you to leave if you need to, but I feel like we could have talked for the whole semester. I mean, there is so much to unpack that this barely touches the surface, including feelings, you know, professors have varying amounts of comfort with being able to deal with the trauma that's in front of them.
Yes.
And, you know, and when and how do you navigate that? When do you refer, which is always a good thing to do? You know, so there's a lot of layers here. So I do want to invite people to stay to continue to talk for a little bit if you need to, or would like to. We also have some other events coming up. This is not the end of the discussion about trauma in the classroom. We're going to have an online offering on Zoom at noon on Monday, October 25th. Wednesday, we're going to do, I should have it written down in front of me. I never remember the whole name, but it's a circle, a healing circle. And it's going to be, hopefully, if it's nice, outside on the lawn near Beaumont. If it's not nice, we'll move into the Angel College Center in the alumni conference room. On Thursday, self-care, we did a lot with self-care in our first round. We're not done with self-care. People loved doing them. And we can see here, there's such a need. So we do have Paul Deal helping us do some meditation. That's gonna be on, it's gonna be in person. Locations to be announced. I think it's gonna be in the reading room of the library, but I need to make sure that we've got that space. But we'll also have it online for those who can't be there in person. And then another in-person event after a mass shooting happens. We have Kurt and Amy Gurvich, who were at Virginia Tech during their mass shooting. And they're going to talk about some of the needs for self-care and the need for handling situations when something that big happens. So we hope you'll join us. There's bit.ly/trauma series 2020. We'll get you the whole list and we'll allow you to register. And just a minute.
Also want to announce October 28th and 29th, I'm offering a workshop on ungrading, which fits very much into this and addresses some of the systemic issues. It's in person, October 28th, or sorry, vice versa, a Zoom, October 28th, and in person, October 29th. You can sign up on.
And that will be a great introduction to our final series of events, which is on the ethics of grading.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.